Death has typically worn a uniform throughout military history. It comes with the crushing weight of armor, the scream of dive bombers, and the thunder of artillery. You know to flee when you encounter an enemy. You are aware of the need to hide. However, Death did not appear to be a monster amid the 1943 occupied streets of Harlem. It didn't appear to be a soldier. It appeared to be a schoolgirl. Her age is 14. As she rides her bicycle into the afternoon shadows, her dark hair is styled in 2 long braids that swing softly on her shoulders. She is invisible to the German guards stationed at the checkpoints. She is not dangerous. A young girl doing errands for her mom. They give her a smile. Without hesitation, they wave her through. The wicker basket on her handlebars is not inspected by them. They will lose their lives as a result of that error, because a loaded FN is concealed beneath a soiled rag in that basket, tucked away among food and school books. The girl with the braids is an expert user of the Browning handgun. Freddy Oversteegen is her name. She's not going home to play with dolls. She's out hunting. It's not a fairy tale. This is the bloodied, classified truth of the Dutch resistance. 3 young females were fighting a clandestine battle in the shadows, while the Allies were getting ready to storm the Normandy beaches. They didn't use tanks in combat. Even the Gestapo was intimidated by their brutal bravery, seduction, and deceit. They were the girls who made fun of dying. They were the youths who ensured the Nazis never left the woods after luring them in. You cannot begin with the gun in order to comprehend how a youngster turns into an assassin. The hunger must come first. The world that shaped her before the first German boot set foot in the Netherlands is where you must begin. In September 1925, Freddy Oversteegen was born in Schoten, a village close to Haarlem. However, she was not born into the tulip-filled postcards of modern-day Holland. She was raised in the hardships of the working class. Her family's floating home on the canals was a barge that smelled of despair, coal dust, and stagnant water. Her father was an idealistic man who performed French songs, but was unable to provide for his family. Truus Oversteegen, Freddy's granite-cut mother, was the source of the iron in her blood. In a time when being a communist made you a target for everyone, she was one of them. However, Truus didn't think politics was about theory. It has to do with surviving. It was about the immigrants who hid in the dank, dark hold of their barge in order to escape persecution in Lithuania. Before they could even read, Freddy and her older sister Truus learned the first lesson of war. You do not turn a blind eye when humanity is at stake. You take action. The family's poverty increased after the marriage broke down and they were compelled to leave the boat and move into a small apartment in Haarlem. Their mattresses were made of straw. They dressed in used clothing. However, Truus instilled in her girls the idea that dignity was unrelated to wealth. She registered them as members of the Dutch Youth Federation. Freddy and Truus were creating dolls for children left orphaned by the Spanish Civil War, while other girls were learning how to sew. They realized there were scary fascists on the rise. After then, the heavens collapsed. May 10th, 1940. The Netherlands caught the attention of the German war machine. The invasion was fast, vicious, and degrading. The blitzkrieg was too strong for the Dutch army, despite their best efforts. It was over in 5 days, that's all. The Queen ran away to London. The Luftwaffe carried out a terror attack that destroyed the heart of Rotterdam and compelled a capitulation. All of a sudden, the enemy controlled the streets of Haarlem. The government buildings were covered in swastika flags. The new beat of everyday existence was the sound of jackboots on cobblestones. Most people's natural reaction was to keep their heads down, survive, avoid eye contact, and wait for the British or Americans to come to their aid. The Oversteegen home, however, was unique. They didn't hold off. The family started to protest almost immediately. It began modestly. Paper was the first step. The printing press clanked so loudly that they had to post lookouts on the street corner, to keep an eye out for police while they printed illegal pamphlets in their living room. Truus, 16, and Freddy, 14, would sneak out at night with posters and glue. The girls stuck up warnings like "Don't go over any German ads trying to lure Dutch workers to Germany. A German man travels to the front to kill for each Dutchman employed in Germany. It was risky. It was against the law. However, it was merely an annoyance to the occupiers. Men were needed by the Germans. They were trying to find soldiers. They had no intention of searching for kids. In 1941, that was altered. The Oversteegen flat door was knocked on. A man by the name of Frans van der Wiel stood there. He led the Haarlem Council of Resistance. He was a serious man who lived in constant fear of being tortured and put to death at any time. He entered, removed his cap, and took a seat in the most uncomfortable chair in the family. He gave Truus a look. He then turned to face the two girls. He was aware of their actions. He was aware of the posters. He was aware of the pamphlets. However, he was not there to offer them congratulations. He was not recruiting them to distribute flyers, even though he had come to recruit them. Frans spoke softly as he leaned forward. He required couriers who could sneak throughout the city. He required scouts capable of keeping an eye on the German airfields. He also required combatants. "Are you willing to learn to use weapons?" he asked the two teenage ladies, looking them in the eye and posing the question that would permanently destroy their youth. There was silence in the room. This was no longer a game. This wasn't breaking curfew. Treason was committed here. This was the death penalty. The concern that lingered in the air was posed by the oldest sister, Truus. Will we have to kill people? They were not misled by Frans. He didn't sugarcoat the conflict. Yes, he said, but we target the real fascists, the traitors, the ones who hunt down our people and send Jews to the camps, not just anybody. The girls turned to face their mom. Freddy Oversteegen had to make an unfeasible decision. No mother wants to put her kids in danger. A 14-year-old daughter pulling a trigger is something that no mother likes to think about. Truus turned to face the world outside, seeing the harsh reality unfold. She nodded, giving her silent approval. However, she placed a condition on it, a rule that would follow Freddy for the rest of her life. She advised them to always stay human. You must never emulate them. You fulfill your obligations without losing your soul. Remain human at all times. It was a lovely sentiment. However, Freddy would discover over the next few months that such regulations are rendered meaningless by conflict. The training started right away. They were led to an underground potato shed that was concealed from inquisitive eyes. The air was heavy with the stench of mold and earth. Frans put a handgun in Freddy's tiny hand there in the faint light. It was cold and heavy. It was strange. "Aim," he murmured. "Squeeze. Avoid pulling." Freddy was fired. Her arm was startled by the kickback. She repeatedly struck the target despite the loud noise in the cramped area. Her quiet pulse and steady hand were innate talents. She discovered how to disassemble and clean the weapon. She became proficient in grenade priming. She discovered how to set up dynamite to derail a train track. Her age was 14. She ought to have been more concerned with boyfriends, her grades, or what to wear to a dance. Rather, she was studying the most effective method of taking a human life. But it wasn't an assassination that was their first actual mission. It was a test of their nerves. Arson. The Nazis' storage warehouse was the objective. The strategy was straightforward, careless, and totally dependent on the fact that German soldiers were men, and men are easily distracted. Truus and Freddy got suited up. They applied cosmetics. They relaxed. They approached the SS officers manning the warehouse gates directly. They grinned. They made flirtatious moves. They pretended to be naive, enamored Dutch girls. Bored and lonely, the guards devoured it. They were enthralled with the little sisters and leaned in to light cigarettes and chuckle. The shadows moving behind them went unnoticed by them. The other rebel members sneaking into the rear of the warehouse escaped their notice. The air began to smell like smoke a few minutes later. The warehouse was on fire by the time the alarm went off. With their hearts thumping against their ribs, the two attractive girls had disappeared into the darkness. They had succeeded. They had dealt the Reich a blow. It was thrilling. It seemed just. However, setting a structure on fire is one thing. It's quite another to look a man in the eyes and take his life. And that time was drawing near. Saboteurs were not the only thing the Council of Resistance needed. Liquidators were required. The Nazis were becoming more intelligent. To find Jews and resistance leaders, they were employing Dutch collaborators, traders, who were familiar with the neighborhoods and the populace. These partners posed a threat. It was impossible to argue with them. They couldn't be imprisoned. They needed to be taken out. The command was issued. A man who was responsible for the murders of innocent families was the target. The mission was given to Freddy. She grabbed her bike. She looked in the basket. Beneath the cloth was the rifle. She started to pedal. The streets were damp and gray. In the chilly air, her breath misted. She was familiar with the path. She was aware of his location. She must have had a million ideas racing through her head while she rode. "Always stay human," said Trinche. The enemy's face, the anxiety of being discovered. She was going to be executed right away for her actions. However, she didn't go back. She caught sight of him. He was merely a dude. He wasn't a fanged monster. He was a man strolling along the road. Perhaps he was contemplating his meal. Perhaps he was considering his position. Freddy came closer on his bike. Her hands were firm, but her heart pounded like a caged bird. She extended her hand into the basket. The cold steel of the clasp was encircled by her fingertips. She didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to think twice. She drew the firearm. She made it level. The quiet of the street was broken by the sound of the gunfire. The guy tripped but didn't go down right away. Confused and wounded, he collapsed on the sidewalk. In that moment, Freddy's gut, the instinct of a 14-year-old girl brought up to be compassionate, screamed at her to stop. She desired to let go of the bike. She wanted to rush over to him. She desired to assist him in getting up. Years later, she would tremble and declare, "I've shot a gun myself, and I've seen them fall. And what's going on inside of us right now?" You wish to assist them in standing up. But she was unable to assist him in getting up. She had to continue riding. She had to vanish. She had just stepped beyond a boundary that is irreversible. She was no longer merely a girl with braids. She was a murderer. The truth of what she had done hit her hard that evening. The terror was all that remained after the adrenaline subsided. A life has been taken by her. The fact that he was a Nazi was irrelevant. The fact that he was evil was irrelevant. She had transformed him from a human being into a corpse. But tears were out of the question. The conflict was getting worse. The Nazis were holding on tighter. The number of deportations was rising. More than a shooter was required by the resistance. They required a lure. They discovered something horrifyingly effective. Women were undervalued by the Germans. They undervalued young, attractive women in particular. Instead than viewing them as threats, they saw them as targets for conquering. The resistance chose to turn that desire into a weapon. This is where the honey trap originated. It was a strategy that called for steely nerves and the capacity to repress all instincts for survival. It was a straightforward and suicidal plan. Truus or Freddy would enter the taverns and bars that German officers frequented. They would sit by themselves. They would appear weak. The girls would not flee when an officer approached, and they always did. They would interact. They would grin. They would hear the inebriated boasts of the men possessing their nation. They would then release the bait at the appropriate time. "Do you want to take a stroll? A stroll across the forest?" The officers would concur, believing they were going to strike it lucky. They would depart from the public bar's security. They would go into the forest darkness with this lovely little girl. They didn't realize they were entering their own graves because they were led by the promise of romance. Consider the psychological cost. You are 15 years old. You are marching hand in hand with a man you despise and who stands for the devastation of your nation. His quips must make you laugh. He must be able to touch your arm. As you guide him more and farther into the forest, you must maintain a steady breathing pattern. You are aware that he will die in 5 minutes. The resistance fighters would occasionally be hiding in the undergrowth. The ambush would begin when the girl signaled. However, there wasn't always a backup. At times, it was just her pocket gun, the cop, and Freddy. One particular mission sticks out as the pivotal moment in their development as warriors. It concerned a senior SS officer who was notorious for his cruelty. For weeks, the resistance had been following him. He was too cautious to be shot on the street. It was necessary to entice him. Freddy was selected. She wore her finest gown. She straightened her hair. He was drinking in the tavern when she entered. The stench of alcohol and smoke filled the air. She took a seat at the bar. The policeman saw her right away. He was self-assured and conceited. He got her a drink. Freddy did a fantastic job with the role. Despite her shyness, she showed interest. She gave him the impression that he was enchanting her. He didn't think twice about taking a walk to observe the moonlight on the river when she suggested it. He got up, straightened his uniform, and went with her. They left the town's lights behind. The tavern's din subsided. The night fell silent. Freddy guided him to a remote route that the resistance was familiar with. Every move was risky. He could break her neck in an instant if he understood what was going on and saw the terror in her eyes. She needed to keep him talking. She needed to divert his attention. He may have remarked, "It's beautiful out here." Freddy would have said, "Yes," reaching for her coat pocket. "It's really quiet." They arrived at the agreed-upon location, a wooded area. Freddy stopped in his tracks. She looked up at him. Grinning, the cop moved in closer, anticipating a kiss. Rather, he peered down her FN Browning's barrel. There was no terror on his face. It was sheer shock. He was unable to comprehend it. The girl, the youngster. Freddy didn't give him enough time to comprehend. The trigger was pulled by her. The trees rang with the blow. The policeman passed out. No romance existed. No glory was present. There was only a dead body in the mud and a teenage girl standing over him, her hands trembling wildly and her ears ringing. She did not instantly flee. She fixed her gaze on him. This was the reality of the war she had selected. It was personal. It was unclean, and it was ruining her from the inside out. Trine would wait for her daughters at home. She refused to inquire about specifics. She would be able to glimpse the 1,000-yard stare that warriors receive following intense fighting. She would comfort them while they sobbed. She would rock them like the kids they were meant to be. Freddy would cry, "I am a monster. I am a murderer." "No," Trine would angrily mutter. "You serve in the military. Lives are being saved by you. Remember that at all times." Killing just didn't cut it to save lives. To safeguard the most vulnerable, everything had to be risked. The Netherlands' Jewish population was being methodically exterminated by 1943. Families were being transported east to camps like Auschwitz, and Sobibor, after being hauled from their homes and placed onto cattle carriages. Although the Oversteegen sisters were unable to halt the trains, they were able to save the kids. The war of smuggling was their other conflict. They would visit the Krusche, which were holding facilities used to house Jewish children prior to deportation. They would spirit the kids away while collaborating with other rebel members. How can a Jewish child navigate a city full with Nazis who are on the lookout for Jews? You conceal them in plain sight. Freddy would grab a child's hand. She would murmur, "Don't say a word. Act like I'm your sister." The SS patrols would be directly in front of them. Freddy would pretend to be a carefree girl watching her sibling while chatting to the toddler and pointing at birds and clouds. She was screaming within. They would both be put to death immediately if the infant cried, spoke Yiddish, or a soldier requested documents. This how they relocated dozens of kids. They transported them to rural safe places. They concealed them beneath bookcases, in attics, and in barns. However, they were unable to save everyone. The air raid sirens started to sound one afternoon when Freddy and Truus were relocating a group of kids. Overhead were Allied bombers. The anti-aircraft guns fired. The streets were covered in shrapnel. They looked for shelter. They made an effort to protect the kids with their own bodies. However, war is indiscriminate. A bomb went off close by. It was a severe concussion. Freddy rose up, her ears ringing and wheezing as the dust settled. She searched the area for the kids she had vowed to keep safe. Although she located them, she was unable to save them. She would always be affected by that day's anguish. It felt like a cruel joke to fight so hard and take so many risks only to lose them to a random bomb. She became hardened by it. The gun in her pocket felt both heavier and more essential as a result. Around this time, the two formed a trio. They got to know Hannie Schaft, a young lady. She was a student of law. She had a mane of bright red hair that made her impossible to miss, and she was fierce and brilliant. Hannie was her name. Hannie Schaft was one of a kind. With a quick mind, she chose to leave college rather than pledge loyalty to the Nazis. She desired a battle. She became a member of the Council of Resistance and developed feelings for Freddy, Truus, and Hannie, the sisters. The three resistance musketeers. Hannie infused the ensemble with fresh vitality. She was more political and older, but she was also careless. Her crimson hair turned to become a symbol. Reports of a red-haired girl involved in assassinations and sabotage began to reach the Germans. They listed her as one of their top priorities. They grew inseparable as a trio. In safe houses, they slept together. When there was almost anything to eat, they shared meals. After a hit, they had to share the dismal chore of cleaning their weapons. They united as a family, bound together by blood. But the gloom deepened as the fighting continued throughout 1944. It was getting close to the Hunger Winter. As the Allies drew closer, the Germans grew more ferocious out of desperation. They weren't just taking over the country. They were starving it, stealing from it, and killing anyone who looked at them wrong. And the distinction between justice and retaliation started to get hazy for Freddy. Truus presented a story that perfectly captures the utter terror of their everyday lives. They saw a roundup in the street one day. Men were being seized by German forces and placed on trucks. A young father was cradling his baby. The baby was taken from the father's arms by an SS officer who was irritated by the weight. The soldier killed the child in front of the screaming parents, right there against a brick wall. The details of what transpired next are too horrifying to convey. Freddy and Truus were observing from a distance. At that point, they were armed. There was no strategy. The council had not issued an order. All that was present was unadulterated, blazing hatred. Truus emerged from her hiding place. She remained silent. Raising her revolver, she struck the SS officer in the head. Suicide was the cause. Suicide was the appropriate course of action. Right then, they ought to have been shot and killed. However, they had a brief moment due to the confusion and the other soldiers' disbelief. They took off running. With their lungs burning and boots thumping behind them, they scurried over fences and across alleyways. They got away. However, the soldier's picture and the baby's image were ingrained in their retinas. Freddy Oversteegen lived during this conflict. It wasn't a conflict between generals and maps. In the woods, it was a battle of fallen heroes and innocent lives. To get through the day, you had to let part of yourself go. And the threat was set to intensify as 1944 gave way to 1945. Now the Nazis knew who they were searching for. The most sought-after women in the Netherlands were the red-haired girl and her accomplices. The net was getting closer. Additionally, one of them would not survive. 1944's winter was more than a season. It was a weapon. The Hunger Winter was the name given to it. The south of the Netherlands was freed by the Allies, but the north, where Freddy, Truus, and Hannie were fighting, was still under tight control. The Nazis shut off all food supplies as payback for a railway strike. The canals became completely frozen. The electricity and gas were turned off. Starvation and gloom descended upon the nation. To survive, people were consuming tulip bulbs. Potato skins were being boiled. Because no one had the strength to bury them, men and women passed away in the streets from weariness, and their remains were abandoned there. The majority of folks in this frigid hell were merely attempting to survive for another day. However, the three girls weren't only getting by. They were becoming worse. The assassinations persisted, but they now had dynamite in their arsenal. The war was no longer the same. Picking out specific officers in the woods was no longer an option. The goal was to use Dutch equipment and loot to prevent the German machine from fleeing. In order to destroy the infrastructure, resistance was required. 19-year-old Freddy Oversteegen became an expert in explosives. Picture the scene. The time is 3 in the morning. 20 degrees below zero is the current temperature. Like a sharp blade, the wind slices through your thin coat. Next to a frozen railroad embankment, Freddy and Truus are laying on their stomachs in the snow. The cold has numbed their fingers, making them awkward. However, they are immobile. Because they are working with hazardous explosives, they are unable to shiver. On the tracks between WWII and Haarlem, they are placing charges. For German military transportation, this is the primary route. They blow themselves to pieces if they misjudge the timing. The German patrols manning the line will use machine guns to shred them if they make any noise. They operate silently. The charges are taped. The fuses are set. After that, they withdraw into the darkness and bide their time. The ground trembles as the train arrives, a huge black monster spitting flames and smoke. Freddy keeps track of the seconds. The trigger point is crossed by the engine. Boom! Day emerges from the night. Metal cries against metal. Tanks, ammunition, and supplies are dumped into the snow as the train derails and crashes off the tracks. For the Germans, it is a spectacle of devastation. For the girls, it is a catastrophe. It is a victory, but it has a cost. Every act of sabotage is met with retaliation. In retribution, the Nazis kill civilians in addition to fixing the tracks. This is Freddy's moral burden. She is aware that innocent blood may be spilled in retaliation for every train she blasts up and bridge she demolishes. For a teenager, it is a significant burden. At night, it keeps her awake. She has nightmares in which the faces of the dead look at her and ask, was it worth it? However, there is no going back. The enemy is aware that they are too deep in the battle. By 1945, one ghost had caught the Nazis' attention. They described their buddy, the girl with the red hair, in great detail, but their descriptions of the sisters were imprecise. Hannie Schaft was now a legend. She represented the opposition of the students. The intellectual assassin was her. She was disliked by the Nazis, not just because she killed them, but also because she was a woman, an academic, a communist, and a Jewish friend. Resistance legend claims that Adolf Hitler was informed about her actions. The order was clear: find the girl with red hair and silence her. Hannie was aware that she was being pursued. She ceased returning home. She no longer went by her true name. Her famous red hair was turned to striking black. To alter her appearance, she wore spectacles with wire rims. She turned into a ghost. But when the walls are closing in, you can't stay hidden forever. The only thing that kept Freddy, Truus, and Hannie sane was their relationship. They were related. In the purest sense, they were sisters in arms. In safe houses, they shared beds and cuddled up for warmth. Their modest portions of tulip soup and bread were shared. They discussed their post-war plans. Hannie aspired to practice human rights law. Her goal was to reconstruct the nation. All Freddy wanted was to go to sleep without having to see the faces of the men she murdered. They agreed that they would either die together or survive together. But pacts are broken by conflict. Less than 2 months before the war ended, on March 21st, 1945, it was a gray, drizzly Tuesday. Hannie Schaft was traveling through Harlem on her bicycle. She was carrying a bundle of WWII, or the Truus, an illicit communist journal. As usual, her weapon was concealed in her basket. She was riding with another member of the resistance, so she wasn't alone. On the Jan Gizenkade Bridge, they got close to a military roadblock. It ought to have been commonplace. Hannie has gone through hundreds of security checks. She wore a disguise. She had black hair coloring. Her ID documents were forged. However, fate is harsh. The soldiers stopped them due to a random search order, not because they knew who she was. Her baggage were examined. Newspapers about treason and sedition were discovered. The gun was then discovered. Hannie Schaft was immediately taken into custody. After being hauled to the police station, she was taken to the Amsterdam prison. The Germans in the area initially had no idea who they had taken prisoner. She was a nobody to them, simply another courier for the resistance. However, they then took a closer look. In the cell, days went by. Her hair started to lose the inexpensive black dye. The roots started to show a vivid, unmistakable scarlet. The prison admin felt like she'd been zapped. She wasn't just a courier. She was part of the crew. The ghost. The myth. The red-haired girl. The questioning was harsh. They were looking for names. They were looking for places. They specifically requested the identities of the 2 sisters she collaborated with. They want Truus and Freddy. In a chilly cell by herself, Hannie Schaft faced the Gestapo's full fury. What they did to her during those last few weeks is unknown to us. We are aware that they tormented her psychologically. Her family was already in a concentration camp when they threatened them. They informed her that her comrades had died and that the war was lost. Hannie, however, said nothing. She never let go of Freddy. But she never let go of Truus. Her quiet gained them some time. Panic began to spread outside the prison walls. Their life fell apart when Freddy and Truus learned that Hannie had been abducted. Monsters controlled their sister, their leader, and their greatest friend. It was crippling anguish. However, Truus Oversteegen was a woman who refused to give up. To save her pal, she devised a desperate, dramatic scheme. Although it sounds like something from a film, this is recorded history. Truus discovered the uniform of a German nurse. She falsified documents. She approached the prison's gates directly, where Hannie was being detained. She insisted on speaking with the commandant. She portrayed a worried medical practitioner. She stated that she was there to transport Hannie Schaft, the prisoner, to another facility for a specialized medical evaluation. An automobile was waiting for her. With unbelievable confidence, she lied in front of SS guards while standing in the lion's lair. She shed tears. She begged. She yelled. It nearly succeeded. After a moment of hesitation, the commandant looked at the logs. "I'm sorry," he said. "Schaft, the prisoner, has been relocated. She's not here anymore." Truus's heart broke. It was too late for her. Hannie was transferred to a maximum security questioning facility by the Germans. The attempt at rescue was unsuccessful. Knowing she would never see her companion again, Truus was forced to leave that prison with nothing. For the remainder of her life, the guilt would follow her. I wish I had moved more quickly. If only we had accompanied her on the bike. However, there were no if-onlys. The end was inevitable. The 17th of April 1945, Europe was being swept by the Allies. Hitler was concealed in his Berlin bunker. The German army in the Netherlands was getting ready to give up. The war was all but ended. However, the Nazis needed to carry out one final horrible deed. Hannie Schaft was pulled from her cell by a German executioner and a Dutch traitor named Martin Kuiper, who was known for his terrible reputation. Can you believe that? They loaded her into a car. They took her to the Bloemendaal Dunes, which are close to the ocean. It was a location of demise. Hundreds of resistance fighters had been killed and buried in the sand of the dunes, which served as a mass grave. The vehicle was brought to a stop. Hannie was told to leave. She walked into the dunes calm and collected, knowing exactly what was coming. No pleading, no tears, just pure pride. The North Sea wind blew through her hair, revealing its natural red hue once more. The men lifted their rifles. The first shot went off. The German fired it, but his hand trembled. Hannie was wounded, but not killed when the bullet struck her head. In the sand, she dropped to her knees. Then, in a moment that has reverberated across Dutch history for 8 decades, Hannie Schaft spoke her last words while looking up at her executioners while bleeding, lightheaded and facing down a pistol barrel. One final time, she made fun of them. "I shoot better than you." Furious by her disobedience, the Dutch traitor Kuiper came out. He brought his submachine gun up. He didn't fail. A flash of flame. The dunes were once again silent. 3 weeks prior to her country's freedom, the girl with the red hair was killed. Her age was 24. In the hopes that she would be forgotten, they buried her in a shallow grave on the sand. They thought her legend would be engulfed by the sand. Freddy and Truus were unaware of her passing back in Haarlem. Not quite yet. They held out. They hoped. They hoped Hannie would be able to flee during the chaos of the end of the war. Every list of inmates who had been freed was scanned. They observed each vehicle carrying refugees on their way back to their homes. May 5, 1945, Day of Liberation. Tanks from Canada entered the Netherlands. The orange banners and the applauding spectators emerged. People were crying in happiness, kissing soldiers, and dancing in the streets. The nightmare had ended. However, Freddy Oversteegen thought the celebration was pointless. She was 19 years old, an elderly woman in a teenage body, and she stood among the crowds. The man on the bicycle, the officer in the woods, the kids in the bombing, and Hannie were all ghosts to her as she watched the festivities. "Hannie, where were you?" Weeks later, the truth was revealed. They found the mass graves amid the dunes. 422 bodies were discovered. There were 421 males and 1 female. Freddy and Truus were devastated to hear the news. The battle was won. However, they had failed. Their soul's third component has been torn away. The history books typically end at this point. The conflict is over. The credits begin to roll. The heroes return home. However, that is not how actual life operates. After being a teenage assassin, you don't simply return home. After seducing and killing guys, you don't simply return to your normal life. The hardest struggle Freddy Oversteegen had still to fight was not against the Nazis, but rather against the quiet. A government that hated her views, a society that didn't want to hear her narrative, and the demons in her own head that wouldn't go away. For Freddy, the conflict had just begun, even though the gunfire had ceased. On May 5, 1945, the gunfire ceased. The tanks fell silent. The uniforms were stored. For Freddy Oversteegen, however, the quiet was more deafening than the explosions. How can you stop a murderer? You can't just tell a 19-year-old girl who has witnessed children die, killed Nazis in cold blood, and lost her best friend to a firing squad to become a housewife. The globe desired to put the conflict behind them. The war did not want to forget Freddy, but Freddy wanted to forget the war. Freddy and Truus were lost in the immediate aftermath of the liberation. Yes, they were heroes, but they were flawed heroes. They stayed in the Lou Palace, a rehabilitation facility for resistance warriors established by Queen Wilhelmina. It was meant to be a healing location. But when you close your eyes and see the faces of the men you shot, how do you get better? Freddy had what is now known as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. They didn't have a term for it back then. They just referred to it as nerves. She experienced night terrors. Sweating profusely, she would wake up in her bedroom shouting and battling unseen warriors. She experienced days of incapacitating depression when she was unable to leave her bed. Remy, her son, would later remark, "My mother's war never ended. Every day, it was on her mind. She made an effort to act natural." John Decker, an engineer, was her husband. 3 children were born to them. Her diaper was changed. Dinner was prepared by her. She took care of her garden. She was merely a modest, well-respected Dutch mother to the neighborhood. They were unaware that the people pouring their tea had previously set dynamite on railroad tracks. Later on, Freddy claimed that the only thing that could save her was starting a family. She stated, "I was creating life after being surrounded by death, by getting married and having children." However, the nation she fought for was busy erasing her history while Freddy was attempting to create a future. This is the section of the narrative that will make you furious. You see, Freddy and Truus were communist resistance warriors, not merely resistance fighters. They were brought up according to the Red custom. Germany was the adversary during the conflict. However, the world changed as soon as the war was over. The Cold War started. The Soviet Union was now the adversary. Communism was the adversary. All of a sudden, heroes with red links were not to be honored by the Dutch government or their American friends. Politically, it was inconvenient. Resistance veterans received medals, honors, and parades in addition to pensions. However, Freddy and Truus were left out for years. They moved their files to the bottom of the pile. They were ignored. Imagine the insult. You put your life in danger every day for 5 years. You murdered for your country. You witnessed the execution of your best friend, and now the government claims that your service is invalid due to your political beliefs. Freddy was severely stung by it. However, she also experienced the pain of sexism. Men were writing the war story for other men. The valiant soldiers on the beaches were mentioned in the history books. They discussed the male leaders of the resistance. When they did discuss women, they did it as nurses or messengers rather than as killers or liquidators. The idea that a teenage girl might pull a trigger with the same coldness as a man was not yet accepted by society. It was terribly unpleasant, so they cleaned up the narrative. Years later, Freddy furiously declared in an interview, "Women don't count. They still don't." Freddy Oversteegen lived in the background for many years. Even her sister Truus gained more notoriety. Truus developed as a sculptor and artist. She penned a memoir. She delivered speeches. She served as their cell's public face. The quiet one who stayed at home and carried the darkness by himself was Freddy. She said that she was envious of Truus. She would tell her spouse, "I was in the resistance too. I carried out the same actions." However, she never asked to be the center of attention. She just put up with it. Decades passed after years. The 1950s gave way to the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. The world was altered. The Soviet Union collapsed. The politics that had put them on a blacklist started to disappear, and the truth started to come to light very slowly. The Dutch resistance began to be examined more closely by historians. They came to understand that Hannie, Truus, and Freddy were the only musketeers in all of Europe. A death team made up entirely of women. It was unprecedented. The murmurs turned into a roar. The quiet eventually ended in 2014. After 70 years of nightmares and neglect, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte declared in 2014 that the Oversteegen sisters will at last be acknowledged. There was no back office for the ceremony. It was a national occasion. Freddy was 88. Truus was 90 years old, They were weak. They had white hair. They were seated in wheelchairs. However, the fire in their eyes remained. The mobilization war cross was pinned to Freddy's chest by the Prime Minister. It is a great distinction in the military. On behalf of the country, he thanked her while maintaining eye contact. Freddy refrained from crying. She took a tall seat. The room fell silent as she donned the medal with respect. It was the proudest day of her son Remy's life. The world finally knows who my mother is, he thought. They inspired the names of streets in Harlem. Filming was done for documentaries. Suddenly, the international media, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC, wanted to know everything there was to know about the girl with the braids. The forgotten soldier, Freddy Oversteegen, rose to prominence as a global symbol of resistance. But time was drawing near, the one adversary you cannot defeat. Truus passed away in 2016. It was like losing a leg for Freddy. Her last days were spent in a nursing facility. At last, her heart was growing weary of the fear and sorrow that would kill a weaker person. But she continued to be witty right up until the very end. Freddy said, "I've been in pain since 1940, when a nurse asked if she was in pain." September 5, 2018. Freddy Oversteegen, the final member of the trio and the final witness, closed her eyes one day prior to her 93rd birthday. A chapter of history came to an end with her passing. She took with her the weight of the rifle in the bicycle basket, the mysteries of the forests, and the precise words she uttered to the men she killed. However, she left us with something more potent than secrets. She asked us a question before leaving. This is a question that has persisted since 1943. Freddy was only a young girl. She was 14. She was fond of dolls. She enjoyed drawing. She lacked authority, money, and the ability to vote. Nevertheless, she did not flee when the night fell, when her neighbors were being taken away, when the army disintegrated, and when the government submitted. She didn't wait for the world to be saved by someone else. She mounted her bicycle. She filled her basket with a rifle, and she rode in the direction of peril. Always stay human was the one rule her mother, Trine, had given her. Freddy tormented herself with that rule for 70 years. She questioned whether the murder had turned her into a monster. In those woods, she questioned whether she had lost her humanity. But now that history is clear, we can provide her with the solution she's been yearning for her entire life. Freddy remained human. She demonstrated it. What could be more human than putting your soul in danger to save a child? When everyone else is on their knees, what could be more human than getting to your feet? The Nazis have vanished. Their millennium-old empire disintegrated into rubble. They have names that are curses. However, the adolescent riding the bicycle, the girl with the braids, is eternal. The Oversteegen sisters' story has been this. Please hit the like button and share this video if this tale touched you and you think their names ought to be known in every classroom worldwide. Don't allow their tale to fade once more. I'll meet you in the following.